So as a watch buyer and enthusiast, I bet you're like me. When you're looking to buy a watch, you almost have a checklist in your mind of things you'd love to see from a watch you're looking to buy. Sometimes there is also within that checklist a hierarchy of what matters more to you. So what I wanted to do in this video is look at some different attributes of a watch, features of a watch, maybe things that often we consider when looking to buy a watch that I think are probably not as important as sometimes we like to think. Now, this is not to say that some of these features are not valuable. I think many of them, of course, are, but are they truly necessary for the majority? And do they have as much weight as other features that you might look for when you're looking to buy a watch? So that's really what I'm looking at here. Some of these you might disagree with. Some of them, somebody who deals with a lot of watches on a day-to-day basis, I just see from my own lifestyle, which is different than probably yours. I'm not gonna get into some loaded topics here. Like one as an example is in-house movements. Probably could be mentioned as some type of concept with the semantics around that term. I'm not going to address that. I have a whole video on that topic. Now, before we jump in here, I also wanna mention if you want a great jumping off point for all things watches, we have a definitive list of some of the best men's watches in the market for 2023, looking at different price ranges, different types. I think we have over 100 watches on that list. So if you just wanna get lost and just have a great jumping off point, you're first starting in your collecting journey, you wanna know what's out there on the market, I definitely recommend that article as a resource. Will be in the description down below. Now for our first feature on this list, we have the original strap. And I do wanna make a distinction here. I'm not talking about bracelets because I do think bracelets are harder to pull off from a third-party perspective because of how the end links work, how it forms to the case. But when you come to just conventional straps, rubber, leather, NATO, for me, I don't really care about this very much because for myself, if it is such of a problem, I will just switch it for a third-party option. When you're dealing with the affordable segment, this is especially true. Pretty much anything under $1,000, if the strap that comes with it is not that great, I don't really hold too much weight in this just because it's so easy to find another option for myself. And I probably already have dozens of different options for myself in my own strap collection. So this is something that for me is never a big issue. And when you're dealing with the affordable tier, many brands almost see the strap and the attachment as more of a cost-cutting measure to allow more to go into the watch. And for me personally, I would rather them do that. I could always just go ahead and find another 20mm strap that's gonna work for the watch. I have plenty of those in my collection, so that's not a problem for me. And even if you are somebody that's just getting started, say you wanna add a little bit more money to your collection, give you some more versatility, it's a good thing to invest in. Now, some people might argue with odd number lug width straps that this is an issue, maybe on the more affordable end, but nowadays it's so different. You can get great 19mm, 21mm straps. We even have some on our site if you're interested. I put those straps up against any others. For me, just don't really put that much weight into this unless you're dealing with more of an integrated style design where you have to get something very custom. But if it's a conventional lug width strap, I really don't care too much. Now for the second feature, some people might argue with me on this, but I feel that we as enthusiasts do overblow this concept of water resistance. Now, water resistance to me is a nice to have, but it's not a necessary for my collection. Now, let me just give some context here. Water resistance, of course, if you can get 100 meters, 200 meters, it gets a great safety blanket. But does it impact my day-to-day wear? The reality is, if I look at my collection, including some of my dive watches, and I put them all down to 30 meters water resistance, does my life change and does my connection to those watches change in any way? The sad answer is probably not. I'm probably gonna still grab a Black Bay if it has 30 meters of water resistance or another dive watch that I would have. My lifestyle just doesn't really require me to take these watches very deep. And I would say most people, it's the same way. Of course, if you're in more of an aquatic lifestyle, you're on a boat, maybe you do some swimming with your watch, you might wanna have 100 meters, but do you really need anything more than that? Think about the concept of 100 meters. Most commercial divers are not even going to those depths. You're talking about a 30-story building. That's a ridiculous depth. If you were standing on the edge of a building that was that high, would you be saying, oh, this isn't high enough, we need more than this? But for some reason, when we're dealing with water resistance, we have these extreme circumstances and feeling like, oh, if it's only 100 meters for a dive watch, I need 200, not gonna be a watch for me. Then the guy doesn't even wear the thing in the bathtub. So it's just kind of a silly way that we look at this. Same with the helium escape valve. So all of the water resistance, yes, absolutely nice to have, but do we overblow it in our just hierarchy of maybe requirements? Potentially, and in reality, 50, 100 meters for most people, it's gonna be plenty. Now this is another one that might bother some people that I have this on this list. accuracy to an extent. Now, to an extent is the key thing here. Very similar to water resistance, I do think people generally want the safety net of having some accuracy, of course, having the watch have some utility, but for watches generally nowadays, especially from a mechanical perspective, at least what I am interested in when owning a watch, it's not about having the most accurate watch. Of course, it's great to get those features, but if a watch is, say, from 10 seconds a day to 5 seconds a day, like that jump doesn't really affect my day-to-day very much. There's a diminishing return when it comes to accuracy, and there's a right expectation you should have when looking at a mechanical watch in general. If you look at most entry-level Seiko, Miyota calibers, you're talking about plus or minus 30 to 40 seconds a day. So you're going into this already with these watches not being crazy accurate. And even as you get up a little bit higher, COSC certified, things like this, nice to have, but for me, not necessary. Really, it really isn't. I mean, if my watch is off, say 30 seconds a day, I am not freaking out because the reason why I like the watch is more than just its ability to tell time. If you want something that's purely accurate, I would recommend maybe not looking into watches in general, especially mechanical watches. That's where quartz comes in. That's where digital watches like Casio G-Shocks come into play. So really figure out where it lands. If you are somebody that wants the most accurate watch, I would of course look at quartz or maybe consider using a smartwatch. I can't believe I'm saying that out loud, but it's the truth. If you want a mechanical watch, just come in with the right expectation, and in addition to that, also see like there are diminishing returns with accuracy, I would think, for most people when they're looking at it. Do you really notice something that's, say, off 7 seconds a day versus running in cost parameters? Is that a big jump for you? And does that affect you on a day-to-day basis? For me, the answer is no. For you, it might be different, but I would say this is a little bit maybe overblown in the hierarchy of things. As long as the watch is running adequately and is not crazy off in time and is staying to the parameters that the brand sets, I'm generally happy. Now for our fourth feature here that maybe is a bit overrated for just where it sits in the watch buying hierarchy of things that we like to look for, is Lume. Now Lume is nice. I get the intrigue of being able to have some low light visibility. When this was first unveiled, when you saw more of tritium being unveiled, as well as even radium in years prior, any ability to see in low lit environments, it was done first as the original ability to tell really time in these scenarios that are more life or death. Think of the battlefield. Think of time-elapsed bezels on dive watches and markers on dials, where if you weren't able to tell the time in certain murky environments underwater, you'd be in a tough spot. You probably would be dead because you need to be able to monitor time while underwater. Now when it comes to the modern era of owning a watch, do we really have these types of scenarios for most of us? No. Does Lume have its place? Is it nice to have some cool Lume? Absolutely. But probably by the time it fades, I'm going to reach for my phone anyway, if we're being practical about all of this. In addition, for those that are actually utilizing a watch for their kit, for actually seeing in low light environments, many of them are probably opting for more of a digital type of hybrid watch, like a G-Shock, for example, with a backlight, compared to something that has more traditional super luminova nowadays. And for those type of individuals, I would assume we're talking about less than 1% of the total global population where this is an absolute requirement for their day-to-day kit. For me, Lume nice to have, not always necessary. So now for our next point here, it's not necessarily a feature from more of an aesthetic perspective or from an actual manufacturing perspective. It's just something that people will, of course, associate with a watch when they're looking to buy, and that is some type of investment value. Now, I have been long an adversary against this idea. I understand though also the other side where if you're spending tens of thousands of dollars on a watch, you wanna make sure you have some value retention. You don't wanna see your thing depreciate like crazy. I get it as you start to get really up there and invest a good amount of capital into watches. But the idea of it appreciating in value and this being one of the #1 factors for buying a watch, I think this is where I would say it's completely overrated and also pretty far from reality. The reality is, and I have a whole video looking at just the update of the watch market going into 2023. If you're interested, we'll link to it in the description down below. The reality is there are about 5 brands that generally will have a nice surge in value, and that's only if you can get them at retail. And this is also a phenomenon that has only been created in the last decade or so, if that. And in the past year, we've seen a correction to a lot of these surges. So even if you're factoring in some of these watches seeing a 20% increase in their value over retail. So say you do decide to flip a watch and say it's about 20% over retail, you decide to flip it. #1, no AD is ever going to sell you that watch again because they do not want to fuel the secondary market and what they're going for, because brands like a Rolex, for example, private shop some of these ADs and they find that you're doing this type of thing and they analyze a lot of the stuff that's listed in these different forums and on these different sales sites. They can track this and they definitely will close doors if needed. Rolex Alex is trying to close doors, they don't need any more excuses. So that's number one, you'll cut yourself off from the source. And number two, if you decide to sell it, you have 3 ways of going about selling it. You can go the dealer route, where you're gonna sell it to someone who's gonna flip it for a higher premium. You're gonna cut into your just 20% margin. So imagine most dealers, I would imagine, are around that 15% margin in the pre-owned sphere, if that. For some of the hot models, much less. So that's gonna be going to them. So you're talking then only about maybe 5%. And then you're dealing with any transaction fees associated with that. If you're looking at auction houses, very similar idea. And then if you go the independent route, then you have the challenges of just trying to sell the watch, even for market value. Most people, if they don't see that you have a track record in selling watches, have all these transactions in your history, they're going to be reluctant to want to buy the watch from you and are gonna have a lot of questions, probably won't wanna go the extra mile. Then if you're gonna deal with that, you have to deal with the transaction fees associated with it. So if you're using even a standard just credit card application, even for our site, when we're just processing credit card information, that's 3% just off the top dollar automatically for processing most cards. Then you're dealing with shipping, having to handle that, insurance, potential fraud or chargeback scenarios where you lose the watch and they issue to their credit card company. Like, this is stuff that people that aren't doing these high transactions even think about, something that as you're into it, you realize like, oh wow, there are people out there that are gonna be against this. So there's kind of a scary scenario with even going independent. So the reality is, you look at some of these watches, where really are the sustainable opportunities to do this? I buy watches because I love them, and I think most people that watch the channel are like that as well. So this is another one that I will definitely just bring out as saying a little overrated. So for our next feature here, we have one that I would say some people might argue with, but I'll give my case why, and that is screwed in links on bracelets. So I would say most people would agree that screwed in links are seen as more premium. You're dealing with some additional threading. It's better than just having more just push pin type of bracelets for most. But I question whether or not is that truly something that is really bringing that much more value to you as an end consumer. Now, the first question I'll bring up is, how often are you actually changing your links once you get the size picked out? Like for myself, if I have something that doesn't have micro adjustment, it might take a little bit longer to get it fine tuned and just feeling good about it. Like I'm wearing a Grand Seiko right now. They're sometimes susceptible to that type of issues with trying to get perfect sizing. But after some time, usually like a week or so, I'm able to fine tune what my sizing is and find the best spot. But then if it has micro adjustment, there's a case that I might never, after even the first setup, have to change a link ever again. So then if that's the case, it really, for me, just comes down to what's less likely to fail, and then also in addition to that, what's less likely to be damaged. When you are dealing with screwed in links, sometimes you can strip the screw and that can create some challenges. Also, if the pin system is good and it doesn't come undone, then I don't necessarily have that many issues. Now, screwed in links, would I personally like to see them more? Probably a little bit more, but it's also not a deal breaker for me because of just how infrequently I am going to be changing out my bracelet links if it does come with micro adjustment. Now, micro adjustment I think is absolutely a huge feature that I think is almost underrated by most of the brands in production. But when you're talking about screwed in links, pin links, I just don't do that too often, and I'm resizing things where it becomes a big issue for me for my own personal collection. Now for our last point here, we have heritage. Now some people might totally agree with this, some people might disagree. I think heritage is valuable when you're looking at just brand, just equity, being a known name, knowing that they know their stuff. They've been in the industry for a long time. But we're in an industry where there's a lot of marketing embellishments, of course. And I would say this, heritage is important, but if I had to pick between what have you done for me lately versus heritage, I think I would go for what have you done for me lately. Heritage without producing products to the standard that heritage upholds is not truly good heritage, in my opinion. If you have fallen off and you're not producing product that your heritage is really saying that it represents, then I don't think that is a good thing. I don't think there's a lot of brands that do this too often, but I do think heritage should always be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. I try my best to sift through the kind of nonsense and the marketing embellishments when I'm talking about product. I really try to find specific parts of history that make things unique rather than just throwing any marketing jargon at you, because I think that's really what's important. But you look at something like a Universal Genève, a brand that absolutely, from a history standpoint, heritage standpoint, phenomenal. But nowadays it's just run by, I think, just some individual who just purchased the brand name, and it's not really producing anything. And nowadays it's just a shadow of its former self. You could also look at big things like, does the Rolex Paul Newman Daytona, does that, because of the Paul Newman affiliation, the history there, does that have any effect on whether or not that makes the watch more compelling to you? You could say for the same thing for the Omega Speedmaster. The NASA connection is very cool, but does it matter to you? And does that affect your day-to-day wear? I think all of history is important to know. Heritage and what these brands are bringing forth in an industry like this is important to know. But when it comes to making a buying decision, I would say that you don't take the heritage of a brand with you everywhere you go. Heritage is certainly important, but like I mentioned, heritage without the concept of what have you done for me lately, I do think is rather meaningless. Because you're wearing the watch that's being made today, not something that was made in the 1960s. But all right, guys, that is my list looking at some overrated features and things to think about when you're looking to buy. Not to say that these are not valuable and shouldn't be considered at all. It's just, where do they sit in the hierarchy of all the things that you consider when looking to buy a watch? For me, I feel some of these might have a little bit too much weight than maybe they should. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. If you agree, disagree with any of my choices, leave some comments down below. Love to get this conversation going down there as well. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. How we're able to create all this content here is through selling watches on our site. So if you are in the market for a watch, I really would love to have your business. I know you can buy a watch essentially anywhere, but that really allows us to continue to make this great content for you, and really would appreciate the support. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.